So, good morning, everybody, to this MERICS media briefing on the National People's Congress. I am Claudia Wessling, Director Communications and Publications at MERICS, and I will guide you through this session. Next week, as always, in March, the National People's Congress and the Consultative Conference of the Chinese People will kick off in Beijing. The latter starting March 4th, then March 5th, 3,000 delegates will gather in Beijing for the NPC, as it's called. We have three colleagues here today to introduce us into, well, the event and what we can expect from it. Let me briefly introduce Ms. Grünberg, lead analyst in the team for politics and society at MERICS. We have Jacob Gunter with us, lead analyst in the MERICS economics team, and Helena Legarda, a lead analyst in our team on research of foreign relations. The proceedings here, let me briefly explain. We are recording this session, but we will only record the brief presentations that our experts will give after I'm done with my introductory words. And then the rest of the Q&A and whatever you ask our colleagues here will not be published afterwards. So you can ask anything you like. Everything that colleagues say will be on the record as a general rule. If colleagues think they want something to be off the record, they will say so and stress that. And we would ask you to take this into consideration also and stick to it. If for the Q&A part, the following rules apply, you can either write us something in the chat and I will pick questions and pose them to colleagues, or you just use the raise hand function if you want to speak by yourself, and my colleague, Wanda Nick, who's working here in the background, will open your mic so that you can speak. So I hope I didn't forget anything. And since we only have a brief hour, around an hour, I would directly hand it over to Nis for his introductory words and his analysis. Nis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia, and good morning from Berlin. As always, it's tricky to introduce the NPC before it happens, of course. What I'll try is to give you a short list of what we are watching over the next few days, or next almost 2 weeks, I guess, at the NPC and the CPPCC. So, of course, the political context and the signals that are being sent currently are probably even more hazy and more tricky to interpret than usual. Just a quick reminder: the NPC is not a place to introduce or present new policy. It is only an avenue that formally passes already decided laws. So yesterday, for example, the Politburo met and they discussed formally the work report that will be presented on March 5th. So this is all a show that has been carefully curated, and everything is decided beforehand by the party. Another good reminder is Li Qiang's, the current premier's own words, that the job of the state apparatus, the state council, is to implement the party's decisions. So do not expect anything mind-blowingly new or something that we haven't heard about before. The issues, of course, are a lot currently weighing on Chinese officials' minds. The NPC is a primarily domestic event, so it's on domestic policy. The economic slowing, low consumption, the record low opinion that we've been reporting over the past few days about among the population on the economic outlook, the real estate crisis, public debt, and there's a lot of other things that are important right now and really demand answers from Beijing in terms of giving a direction on where the economy is or where regulators want to take the economy. At the same time, there is no real direction or strategy being laid out, at least in terms that are understandable for most observers, and I guess also for most officials in China. Everyone was expecting the third plenum to meet already last year, so in October, November. Usually, every 5 years, the Central Committee comes together and kind of publishes a new general reform roadmap. This was expected and really also needed. People were hungry for a plan. people were really thirsting for some tangible policy hints as to where to take economic management. This has not happened. Everybody's still waiting for a third plenum. We have been waiting for it. There had been a slight chance that it would have been taken place not these days, so just today, yesterday. This was the case in 2018, where this the kind of the usual practice to put it in fall or winter the year before was already kind of ignored, and the very large structural reform package of 2013 was issued. This has also not happened, so we don't expect any bigger reform plan or policy plan to come out before the NPC, maybe later this year. This means, in short, that there's no real political strategy, economic reform roadmap that is out there yet. To me, this really reads like a clear signal that the more state control type of approach will prevail. We have a lot of signals that these new productive forces are mentioned a lot over the past few days. This will probably be a theme also at the NPC. Self-reliance is big, and security as the core of development it still seems to be the kind of the main logic that's driving anything, or let's say maybe more clearly that is limiting everything in terms of opening up reform or economic reforms. US-China competition, of course, also a main driver of this more securitized approach. So I don't personally expect anything really changing for this year in terms of this kind of tight-lipped approach to governance. There's, of course, a lot of quantitative targets that are going to be announced and that are important at the NPC. My colleague Jacob is better equipped to talk to these. You see the list here. What I personally will look at from a more political, analytical perspective is the last point here on the list, which is the so-called problem page that is outlining what the leadership itself views as the main issues that need to be solved or addressed during the NPC. That's usually the last pages in the NPC work report, after the kind of laudatory language on all the successes of the past year. But it's interesting how long it will be, how forceful the language is, and what new issues perhaps are on this list. In terms of personnel and organizational change, again, I don't really expect a lot of new things. There might be some hints as to a new premier. It's possible, but not entirely likely. These things usually are decided on beforehand and often also announced beforehand. So I would be a little bit surprised, but it is possible that we have a new finance minister, and probably, if so, Liu Jianchao, who has been kind of put in front of a lot of important tasks over the past weeks. He's currently the leader of the party's external affairs department, so he would be a very obvious candidate. Li Qiang will be watched, of course. The current premier, it's his first work report presentation. Everyone hoping that him being a pro-business guy because he was in Shanghai before. Don't hold your breath. I don't think that he will be able to punch any real pro-business agenda, except for good words and lofty language, but not in terms of actual policy. Organizational change in the administration, possible. There might be some slight changes to the central administration. This is quite usual to happen. A few ministries or departments might be reorganized. Entirely possible, but not necessary. This has to be decided on beforehand, and we haven't heard anything to that end. So possible, but that's with a question mark. New laws, the same counts for this one here. And of course, something that we also will have an eye on, and which Helena will especially talk a bit more about, is any harsher language on Taiwan. China's international posture. As I said, the NPC is mainly a domestic event, but there is, of course, room for language and posture in terms of Taiwan, which, in terms of Beijing's own perception, is a domestic kind of issue. but that's also something that we watch. I think with that, I hand over to Jacob and are looking forward to questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Nice. Yeah, so to build on what Nice has so brilliantly introduced, starting off with some of the key economic kind of numbers that we might see come out of the work report or out of some of the different sort of sub-reports from the Ministry of Finance, for example. So the big things that I'm looking at would be the growth target, maybe some budget shifts, and some reporting on public debt. On the growth target, there's of course, as there always is, there's a lot of clamoring from people like myself that would suggest that it would be good for them to finally drop the growth target. Of course, we will likely be disappointed yet again that they will keep it. This is, after all, a system that is run with these kinds of expectations. Interestingly, if you look at the local government work departments or the provincial government work departments or work reports, you end up with only 4 cities or municipalities / provinces actually raising their growth targets year over year. So that would be Beijing, Liaoning, Tianjin, and Zhejiang. Whereas others either kind of stayed the same or lowered their rates. So maybe that means that we end up with something around 5%, like we did last year, maybe a little bit lower. But I'm sure that they'll manage to meet that, irrespective of whether or not that GDP growth rate actually generates new wealth and new value. In terms of budget shifts and debt levels, we'll have to read through the tea leaves on all of those individual changes, but it would be surprising if we see any really remarkable swings. And with the debt levels, of course, we have to take all of that with a grain of salt, because there are the things that Beijing can measure well. There are the things that Beijing can measure relatively well, and then there are the things that even Beijing struggles to measure when it gets down to that really local level of debt, where there's a long history of local officials being able to take debt and hide it away in their own local state-owned enterprises, and into different kinds of funds and such. Moving on from the big sort of numbers, in terms of the kinds of signals I would expect to see, I agree with Nice that I wouldn't expect to see any signals of significant change. Instead, there will be little bits of work kind of at the margins. So whether that's with fiscal policy or kind of socioeconomic de-stressing policies, maybe even some signals and talks about monetary things on the side, that these are mainly going to be to kind of shore up and buttress the economic baseline. But the fundamental priorities that Xi Jinping and the leadership have set out, I don't anticipate that those will change in general, let alone specifically at this event. Instead, I think the signals that, importantly, that party cadres will be looking for will be to try to get a clearer sense of what specific parts of Xi Jinping economic thought and Xi Jinping's ideology they should be prioritizing. Because if you look at a lot of things that come out of things like the Central Economic Work conferences, you end up with more and more things being kind of grouped together into these giant blobs of policy priorities. And functionally, if you end up having such general priorities and you sort of group everything together, you're saying you need to prioritize everything, which is another way of saying that cadres don't know what they should actually prioritize. So they'll instead be looking for signals from Xi Jinping about what to prioritize. And I'd suspect that we'll see something like we saw last year, when there was this very famous moment that really got picked up massively in the media in China, where during one of the kind of breakout sessions at the provincial level, Xi Jinping interrupted a cadre who was, sorry, a representative from Jiangsu who worked in the construction equipment sector. Xi Jinping really abruptly interrupted him in the middle of his presentation and said, "Where do you source your chips from for all of your equipment?" And the businessman came back and said, "Oh, we source all of our chips from China." And this became a really clear signal, because Xi Jinping looked very happy that, the tech self-reliance campaign is a top priority. And so I suspect cadres will be looking for these kinds of things, because otherwise they're kind of paralyzed trying to figure out which things to focus on, and how to strike a balance between these different priorities. Otherwise, in general, I mean, Xi Jinping has been very consistent in his economic policy making over the last several years. Um, so we might get, as Nice mentioned, a little bit of rhetoric here and there from Xi and from other top leaders about, yes, there will be rhetoric on restoring consumption and supporting and boosting consumption, but again, I anticipate this will be at the margins because the real indicator, like the clear indicators, when you look at where capital is actually flowing for the last several years, has been very consistent. It's flowing away from households, it's flowing away from investments into real estate and such, and it's flowing towards the supply side of the economy, into fixed asset investment, into industrial upgrading and industrial expansion. That's the only place that people can reliably put money and get capital. And that's coming at the expense of households rather than in support of them. And until there's a real significant change in the way that the leadership thinks about the economy, I don't anticipate that the signals for strengthening and supporting consumption will materialize in any significant way. And lastly, I just want to say that despite both Nice and I saying, we don't expect major signals of change, that this is kind of a steady as she goes agenda, and the fact that we don't even have a third plenum to give a clear indication, it sounds kind of boring, but it's actually quite remarkable because this is an agenda that is actually quite ambitious, and it's meant to tackle not only kind of the short to medium term economic concerns of the country and of Chinese citizens. It's also meant to really tackle these bigger picture issues and kind of force down a bitter medicine to address a lot of the risks that the leadership perceive as most dangerous to the long-term stability and resilience of the party state. Now, importantly, that's coming at the expense of what is clear in terms of public sentiment of what people want and what people expect. And the fact that you have the leadership at this point so willing to continue pushing things towards in this direction at the expense of public sentiment and at the expense of what people have become accustomed to expecting over the last 10, 20, 30 years in China is actually pretty remarkable. So steady as she goes is actually a pretty radical decision from a certain perspective. And I'll leave it at that. I think over to Helena now.
Thank you, Jacob. And good morning, everybody. This time for myself all the way from London. And I'm very happy to pick up on some of the themes that Nis and Jacob raised when it comes to China's foreign policy. The first point that I would like to make, and this is, I think, a bit similar to what Nis and Jacob said about domestic policy or economic policy, we shouldn't expect too many changes coming out of the NPC. The NPC is first and foremost not a core foreign policy forum for China, even though we, of course, do get signals about potential shifts in priorities or in language and approach. But policy making is not something that is done at the NPC when it comes to foreign policy or to defense policy. And part of the reason behind this, of course, is the fact that foreign policy is led by the party, by Xi Jinping directly through the Central Foreign Affairs Commission. So what we can expect from the NPC in terms of foreign policy is a reiteration of many of the themes that came up at last year's Central Foreign Affairs Work Conference. So stability as the primary focus of the party's international work, a continued push towards achieving the national rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, a call for more sort of struggle or fighting spirit to raise China's international influence and to create a more favorable international environment for China and for the CCP to operate in. The one thing that I will be watching quite closely is the press conference that the Chinese foreign minister always gives a couple of days into the NPC. So in this case, Wang Yi, and I would expect it probably around March 7th. And there he will focus on some of these themes related to China's international behavior, foreign policy, and some elements of China's defense policy that might give us, again, a bit of a sign of any potential shifts in prioritization. Other than that, there's, however, 2 or 3 sort of core issues that I will be following quite closely during the NPC. One, Nis already mentioned, any potential changes in personnel. So we'll be watching whether a new foreign minister might be announced or not. If a new one is announced, there are rumors that Liu Tianzhao is the front runner, although of course we could definitely be surprised on this front. I will also be watching whether a potential new foreign minister or China's new defense minister, who is already in place, Dong Jun, whether they are made state councillors. In the past, both Qin Gang and Li Shangfu were state councillors, which made them sort of rank higher than other ministers in the bureaucracy. So if Dong Jun and this hypothetical potential new foreign minister are not made state councillors, that could signal a number of things, but it could signal a potential sort of diminished trust on the ministries and the departments from Xi Jinping, or it could simply signal that these are temporary sort of replacements, while the system looks for sort of a longer term minister in either defense or foreign affairs. So something to follow, definitely. We will be watching the language on Taiwan, as Nis also mentioned. There's normally a short section on Taiwan at the work report, and it tends to come out as well at press conference and at some of these side events that Xi Jinping takes with either kind of provincial breakout rooms or sort of other kind of more specific kind of topic and theme specific rooms. Again, we shouldn't expect a change in policy or a change in approach. I think that's been quite clear that the party wants to follow its ongoing strategy, but especially after the presidential elections in Taiwan just a few weeks ago, we will be watching to what extent the tone becomes harsher and to what extent the calls to sort of push back against any attempts at separatism coming out of Taiwan becomes maybe a little bit more assertive or a bit more aggressive, which could signal a justification for harsher action going forward. And then the final point I will make in terms of things that we will be watching coming out of the NPC is, of course, China's defense expenditure or military budget for this year. And this is, I believe, a particularly key year at a time when, as Jacob said, the Chinese economy is not doing so well. We're going through an economic slowdown process in China. So what is going to happen with the defense budget will tell us, I think, quite a lot about the Chinese leadership's priorities. Personally, I expect the defense budget to increase at a rate like it has over the last few years, so hovering somewhere around the 6 to 7% increase. We, of course, have to watch it. We'll see what happens. But if that is the case, this would signal, I think, quite clearly that Beijing is still quite concerned about its international environment and that they are prioritizing military modernization in case of potential conflict, even at the expense of certain other sort of economic or social policy issues where this money could be going to. And I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your inputs. So we will see what colleagues say, a tight-lipped approach to government, as Nis put it at the NPC. And something that Jacob called a steady as she goes agenda. Still, the meeting is interesting and definitely important to watch. We will see at least hints of how she wants to proceed with this policy agenda. And also colleagues pointed out that there's a lot of tension between what the party strives for, grand plans, shaping the economy, building up the military. This all costs money. And then on the other hand, there's tensions in the population, worries about jobs, about salaries, about raising housing prices and stuff. So definitely an exciting event to watch. Thank you so far, Helena, Legarda, Nis Grünberg, and Jacob Gunter.